In the winter of 1862, a work crew tore up the floor of a country church, and what they found underneath it was never written into a single sermon, never spoken from that pulpit again. And by spring the entire congregation had agreed, in a formal recorded vote, to pretend it had never happened. The building still stands today. People still get married in it. Children are still baptized at the front of the sanctuary where the old stone was lifted, and almost none of them know that the men who raised the church they are sitting in were not the men who dug what lies beneath it. This is the story of what came up through the floorboards that January, why grown farmers walked out of that sanctuary shaking and would not go back inside, and what a room full of God-fearing people decided was so dangerous that the only safe thing to do with the truth was to bury it a second time and swear each other to silence over the grave. To understand what happened, you have to understand the church itself, because it was already strange long before anyone lifted a single stone. The building sat at the edge of a small farming settlement in the interior of the country, the kind of place that barely appears on the maps of the period. According to the settlement's own records, the town was founded in the 1840s. The church, they said, was raised by the congregation in 1851, plain timber over a stone foundation, nothing worth remarking on. Except the foundation was worth remarking on. It was cut from enormous blocks of dressed granite, fitted so tightly that a knife blade could not slip between them, and it was far larger than the wooden building that sat on top of it. The stone footprint ran well past the walls of the church on every side, as if the timber structure had been dropped like a small hat onto the head of something much bigger that was already there. The old-timers in the settlement had an explanation for this, and it was the explanation everyone accepted for years. They said the founders had simply built on top of an older ruin to save themselves the labour, that the granite was left over from some earlier structure, and the settlers, being practical people, had used what was already in the ground rather than quarry it fresh. It is a reasonable answer. It is the answer you would probably give too, but it did not explain why the granite was warm. There is one more detail about the founding that matters here, and it is the kind of detail that is easy to walk straight past. Nobody in the settlement could say for certain who had chosen the spot. The records name the men who raised the walls, but on the question of who first stood in that clearing and said the church would go here, over these particular stones, the pages are silent. It was simply always understood to be the place. Ask any of the founding families and you got the same worn answer, that this was where the church had always been meant to stand. Several of the men who worked on the original construction had said, quietly and only to family, that the foundation stones held heat in the dead of winter. Not a great amount, just enough that snow would not settle on them the way it settled on everything else in the valley. Just enough that a bare hand laid flat on the granite in January did not go numb the way a hand should. Nobody made much of it at the time. Cold country breeds strange talk, and one warm stone is a small strangeness next to a hard winter and a long way to the nearest doctor. So the church was built and the seasons turned, and for 11 years absolutely nothing happened. Then, late in 1862, the congregation voted to enlarge the sanctuary and lay a proper stone floor over the packed earth at the front. And to do that, the work crew had to break through to the foundation they had been walking over for a decade. That is the moment the 11 quiet years came to an end. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what the congregation pulled out from under the sanctuary floor. The exact measurements of the chamber that was never supposed to exist. The 7 names carved beneath the stone that match no birth record anywhere in the county. The council's own written vote copied word for word, including the final line they scratched out. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. The crew began on a Monday. The plan was simple enough. Lift the old floorboards at the front of the sanctuary, level the earth beneath, and set the new stone. 2 of the foundation blocks sat higher than the rest, breaking the line where the floor needed to run flat, and the foreman decided the only way forward was to lift them out and reset them lower. It took 4 men and a pair of horses to move the first block. When it finally came free, they found that it had not been resting on packed earth at all. It had been resting on a second stone, cut and dressed just as finely as the first, set flush into the ground with a thin seam running around all 4 sides. A lid. The men stood around the edge of it in the lamplight, and not one of them wanted to be the one to say out loud what they were all already thinking. A stone that fits like a lid is a stone that covers something. The foreman sent a boy running to fetch the minister. The minister came, looked down at the seam, and told them to stop work for the day. He said they would open it in the morning with proper light, and with witnesses present. What he did not say, and what several of the men noticed and remembered for the rest of their lives, was that he did not seem surprised. He looked at that seam in the floor the way a man looks at a letter he has been dreading for years, like he already knew what it was going to say. That night, back in their own homes, 3 of the crew could not sleep. One of them, a young man who had done most of the chipping at the edge of the stone, told his wife that when he had pressed his ear near the seam to listen for hollow space, the way you tap a barrel to hear whether it is full, the granite had carried a faint, steady warmth against his cheek, and under that warmth so quiet that he kept telling himself he had imagined it, something that was not quite a sound, not footsteps, not a voice, just the plain sense that the space on the far side of the stone was not entirely empty, and had not been empty for a very long time. They opened it the next morning, and it took most of the day. The lower stone was heavier than the first, and it had been sealed all the way around with a dark resinous material that had to be chipped away by hand, inch by patient inch. By late afternoon they had it loose. 6 men on ropes lifted the lid clear, walked it back, and set it down. And then they looked into the hole. What they were looking down into was a chamber. Not a grave, not a cellar. A chamber cut into the granite bedrock itself, square and deep, and lined on every wall with the same dressed stone as the foundation above. It was perhaps 10 feet on a side, and just as deep, and a set of stairs, narrow and even and worn smooth, ran down one wall into the dark. The air that came out of it was warm. That was the first thing every single witness later agreed on. The air that rose out of that opening in the dead heart of a country winter was warm, and it carried no smell at all, which somehow was worse than if it had reeked of rot. It was the clean, dry, mineral nothing of a place that had been sealed away from the living world for a very long time. The foreman lit a fresh lantern and started down the stairs. 2 men followed him. The rest waited up top around the mouth of the hole, and in all the years afterward, every one of the men who waited up top said the same thing, that they were grateful to the end of their days that they had not gone down. On the way down the narrow stairs, the foreman's lantern threw its light across the walls, and the 2 men behind him saw the carvings before they saw anything else. At first, they took the marks for tool scars, the ordinary damage of quarrying. Then the light steadied, and they understood they were looking at deliberate work, worked stone covered from edge to edge, in a hand far older and far finer than anything the settlement could have produced. And the deeper the 3 of them went, the more of it there was, until it felt less like climbing down into a cellar and more like walking straight into a book that someone had spent a whole lifetime writing, in a language built to outlast everyone who would ever read it. What the 3 men found at the bottom they described to the council later, and the council wrote it down carefully before deciding that no one outside that room should ever read it. There were shelves cut into the stone walls. On the shelves were bodies, not skeletons. Whole bodies, dried and darkened and intact, dressed in clothing that no one in that congregation recognized, clothing of a cut and a make and a fabric that belonged to no fashion any of them had ever seen or heard described, in a settlement that was barely 20 years old. There were 7 of them, and each one had been laid out with obvious care, hands folded, faces composed, and above every shelf, carved into the granite in clean, deep, unhurried letters, was a name. 7 names, and below each name a pair of dates. The men could read the dates. That was the part that broke them where they stood. The dates carved below those 7 preserved bodies. under a church founded in the 1840s, in a chamber sealed beneath a foundation supposedly laid in 1851, began more than 400 years before the town itself had ever existed. Before we move on to the next passage, may I stop for a second? What you just heard about what the sexton and the foreman found when they lifted that second stone is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original council minutes, the 7 names, the scratched out line. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The 3 men came back up out of the chamber, and the foreman would not speak for the better part of an hour. When he finally did, he did not describe the bodies first. He described the walls. Because the walls of that chamber, he said, were not blank. Between the shelves, covering every open surface of dressed granite from floor to ceiling, were carvings, lines and figures and symbols, some of them letters in an alphabet none of the 3 men knew, some of them plain pictures. And the pictures told a story that the whole settlement would spend the rest of that winter trying to unsee. They showed a city, a great city of stone towers and rounded domes and long straight avenues, the kind of city that could not have stood anywhere within 100 miles of that little farming town, drawn by a hand that clearly knew it well. And then they showed that city ending, water rising over the avenues, the towers half swallowed by what looked like mud or ash, small figures fleeing toward the edges. And then, at the far end of the final wall, they showed something being built again on top of the ruin, something small and plain and wooden, a church. And here is the detail the foreman kept circling back to, the one he repeated to the council until they finally told him to stop. The little wooden church carved at the end of that wall, the one built on top of the drowned city, was not a picture of some church that might one day be built. Its shape, its proportions, the placement of its narrow door and its single high front window matched the church they were all standing inside at that very moment. Whoever had cut that final image into the granite had known, centuries in advance, exactly what would be raised over the top of them. They had not been guessing. They had been leaving a message for the people who would one day arrive with axes and wagons, and the message was that none of this was an accident, and none of it was the first time. You have to understand what that meant to the people standing in that sanctuary. These were not scholars, they were farmers, and their wives and their children, people who had been told a simple story about their own town for their entire lives, that their grandfathers had come to empty untouched land and built a settlement out of nothing, raised a church with their own bare hands, and that everything around them, for as far as they could walk, was the work of ordinary men within living memory. And now, under the floor of that very church was a room that said otherwise, a room that said the granite foundation they knelt and prayed on top of every Sunday was not left over from some minor forgotten ruin. It was the roof of a tomb built by people who had lived and died on that exact ground centuries before the town was founded. People who had known a great city where the settlers knew only forest and river. People who had buried their dead in a sealed chamber and left instructions carved in stone that the whole thing be covered and built over and forgotten. The settlers had not built the first thing on that land. They had built the newest thing on a very old grave, and someone had gone to enormous trouble to make certain that when the covering was finally lifted, whoever lifted it would understand exactly what had come before them. In the weeks that followed, 3 families quietly sold off what they could and left the settlement for good. They gave the usual reasons: land waiting back east, a sick relative, better prospects somewhere further on. But their neighbours could not help noticing that all 3 families had been present the morning the lid came off, that not one of them ever set foot in the church again before they went, and that when they finally loaded their wagons, they did it facing away from the building, as though they could not stand to have it at their backs and could not bear to look at it head-on either. The minister called the church council together within the week, not the whole congregation, not at first, just the council, the handful of men who kept the records and made the decisions for everyone else. They went down into the chamber themselves, every one of them, and they copied down the 7 names and the dates and as much of the wall carving as they could reproduce by lamplight. And then they climbed back up, and they argued for 3 straight days. A few of them wanted to bring in authorities from the capital. A few wanted scholars, men who could read the strange alphabet and explain away the impossible dates. But the minister argued hard against all of it, and in the end he won. And the reasoning he gave is the reason the whole thing was buried. He said that if word ever got out that their church, the beating centre of the entire settlement's life, was raised on top of a tomb that predated the founding story by 400 years, then every single thing the community believed about itself would come apart in their hands. The history they taught their children was a lie. The land they thought their grandfathers had been tamed and lost and tamed again by people whose names they had never once been told. And worst of all, someone had known. Someone had built that church deliberately on that precise spot to seal that precise chamber, which meant the founders themselves had known what was underneath the floor and had said nothing, and had handed the settlement down to their own children, wrapped in a story they knew for a fact to be false. So the council took a vote. It is the vote this entire account has been building toward, and they wrote it into their own minutes in careful ink before they ever understood that those minutes would one day be read by a stranger. The decision was to reseal the chamber, to lower the lid back into place, replace the resin around its edge, set the foundation stones back exactly as they had been found, and lay the new floor over the top of all of it as though nothing had ever interrupted the work. The 7 names would not be entered into the church register. The wall carvings would not be reproduced or described to anyone outside that room. And the final resolution, the one every man present put his signature beneath, was that the discovery itself would never be mentioned again, from the pulpit or the porch or the supper table, and that the men in that room would carry it in silence all the way to their own graves. Every last one of them signed. And then, at the very bottom of the page, there is one more line, and it has been struck through with a single deliberate stroke of ink, crossed out but still perfectly readable underneath the mark. It says that they were not the first council to take this vote. That line was crossed out. Somebody wrote it down as true, and then somebody decided it should not be allowed to stand, and drew a line through it and left it there anyway to be found. Think for a moment about what that crossed out line actually means. It means the men who sealed that chamber in 1862 believed or knew outright that they were not the first to open it, that at some earlier point in that settlement or in whatever settlement had stood on that ground before it, another group of entirely ordinary people had lifted that same lid, seen those same 7 preserved bodies and those same carvings of a drowning city, and arrived at the exact same decision. They chose to cover it over, to vote it down into silence, and to build on top of it and hand down a clean and comfortable story, and that if the church stood long enough, someone else would eventually open it again, and someone else would have to make the same terrible choice all over again. The chamber is still down there. That little church still stands, and people still call it one of the prettiest in the county. Its foundation is still warm in the winter, the snow still refuses to settle on it, and every year new families arrive to worship and bury their own dead on top of a room full of 7 names they will never once hear spoken. This, underneath all the noise, is the thing the Tartaria story is really asking you to sit with, not whether there was one single lost civilization out of reach, but whether the ground under your own feet has been built over and forgotten so many times that the forgetting itself has quietly become the tradition. Whether every foundation that seems a little too large for the building on top of it, every stone that holds heat it has no business holding, every founding story that feels just slightly too clean and too simple is resting on top of a chamber that someone generations back gathered in a room and voted never to mention. The congregation in 1862 told themselves they were protecting their community by burying what they found beneath the floor, but they left the minutes behind, They left the crossed out line. And somewhere in a records box inside a small country church that people still drive out to photograph, that vote is still sitting there, patient, waiting for the next crew to pull up the floor.